He got it. So we've been working together for a number of years now on a project on climate smart remining and looking at tailing sites in Armenia and the potential of the metal and value recovery from the tailing sites while improving the environmental conditions, landscape restoration potential. This is a World Bank funded project, and hopefully it will give us some idea and guidance on where to go next. And so with that, hopefully is enough introduction. We're very happy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Shall I start?
Yep.
Yes. All right. So I'm just going to stand because standing is easier when you give a presentation. So I'm Benjamin Sprecher. Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. I work as an assistant professor at TU Delft Industrial Product Design. Do a lot of work on circular economy, resources, critical materials, etc., etc. And in this presentation, I want to talk about like recent policy in. Well, I'm going to talk mostly about the Netherlands, but Netherlands just like a good case study for the European Union in general. And the first bit will be, okay, the Netherlands wants to do a bunch of stuff regarding the energy transition, and what does it actually mean in terms of critical material demand? And then the second part is, okay, what should we actually do about this? Like, what kind of policies could come out of this if you realize that this problem, we need to do something about it? And then I also talk a bit about the European perspective versus the Dutch perspective, but it's a super complicated topic, and I could like spend hours talking about it. So I'll just like keep it a bit limited. Just you all know what critical raw materials are, like in terms of definition? Anyone have a nice definition of what makes a raw material critical? Anyone? Let me give it a go.
I think it's just related to the stock. How much do we
still have?
Yeah, is remaining, and also the what is it?
Yeah, so actually it's interesting. Like one of the things that intuitively people always think is like something is a critical raw material if we don't have enough of it, right? So we're going to run out of neodymium, copper, indium, etc., etc. But actually that's not the problem. For a lot of these metals, we have a huge amount of these metals in the ground, just lying around, like for hundreds of years. To build electric cars today, then you need to have the mine today. And if it takes 10 years to build a mine, then it's, you know, and you say, okay, in 5 years, we want to have a problem. So I did my PhD. My professor worked for Shell most of the time, so he's an oil person. He said it doesn't matter how much oil is in the vat; it matters how quickly you can. Really. So it's critical metals. We need them for electric wind turbines, solar panels. Do I need to click on the middle thing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can we disable the recognition thing? Just let them.
Waiting.
Oh, you're doing it. Okay, good. Then you have access by the phone. Good to know.
Can we also hide the floating panel? It's in more. Go to more
On the right hand
on
side.
the right hand side.
Where?
Right.
And
Hide
then,
floating panel.
Hide. Floating. meeting.
okay, better?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Yeah, I never
Thank
use
you.
Zoom, so I have no idea how it works. So then, turbines, solar panels, but also you need critical metals. Like nowadays, we don't have so many electric cars or solar panels or wind turbines, right? So a lot of these metals are already used for military applications, for just general industry applications. So there's a huge demand for all these different metals, and we'll get to a list later. And then we also are going to need this for all this energy transition, which in Europe is a huge thing. I hope in the rest of the world also. Armenia, I don't know what the policies are, but at least in Europe, we want to switch from to build this up very large. Do I need to like? Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. If it pops up every time,
Then that doesn't make sense, right? We need a lot of this, and this is a really interesting research, right? So we're going to take a look at all of the problems that we encounter in terms of how much stuff we need, and also how much we can get from other places. So just to give you a little anecdote how important this is. So actually in my country, the Netherlands, the government doesn't care about this at all. So I give this presentation very often to policymakers. They're like, oh my God, we didn't know this. But other countries, they take this very serious, right? So I was actually in Washington, DC for a big World Bank event. The launch of the climate smart mining. So it was a couple of years ago. This was 4 or 5. 19? Might have been 16, because it was just when the first time I met Kirsten. Anyway, so a long time ago, and then I said, well, I can't go all the way to Washington, DC to give a 5-minute presentation. You know, I'm an environmental scientist, flying across the ocean for a 5-minute presentation, not good. You know, I cannot tell my students like, oh, you should not be flying, and then I fly for a 5-minute presentation. So I said, hey, can you organize something else for me, like a second thing I can join? And then I got this invitation to a like side event that was unrelated to the World Bank, and it was just it was about the critical raw materials and the supply chains for electric car batteries for the United States. So there were only Americans in the room. I was the only non-American, and it was like, you know, like mining companies, and there were a lot of military people in the room. So there was like a 4-star admiral who was commanding the 7th Fleet, so the Pacific Fleet, one in charge of geopolitical tensions with China. And there was like a senator, and there were all these like, you know, big people. And then they were talking about, okay, we are in trouble because we, as an economy, we have all these companies that need more metals for these electric cars. And now basically China owns all the supply chains, and we don't know where to get the metals, very dramatic. And then one person got up and was giving a presentation. It's all like Chatham House rules, so I cannot say who said what. It wasn't the general, so not that dramatic, but person got up and said, yeah, well, you know, in the past we used to send in our forces to get the oil. So we send in soldiers to secure the oil. And in the future, we're going to have to send in our soldiers to secure the metals. And then I was the only person, like non-American in the room. I was kind of shocked. Like, okay, wow, that's pretty intense statement, you know. And but everyone was like, So just to give you an idea of like this problem of critical metals and this energy transition, we're going to need more of these. This is a really big topic in like geopolitical, like in those terms. And actually, if you then go and see what happened afterwards. So this was in 2014.
So you didn't ask them what is the Netherlands supposed to do?
No, the Netherlands. Did I ask the 4-star Pacific admiral like, hey, by the way, from the Netherlands? Yeah, I don't think they even know the Netherlands exists. They're like, this is the cheese country, right? Okay, so this is 2020.
Yeah.
September. So not so long ago. This was, I think, just before Trump was kicked out of the White House, and actually the day he went to the hospital because he had COVID. So he signed an executive order addressing the threat to domestic supply chain, resilience, critical minerals, foreign adversaries. So foreign adversary means China. And then, well, I actually read the whole thing, it's really interesting. But the highlight is, I hear them. So what are we going to do with this? So that was in 2020. And now actually, so just these are some random newspaper internet websites So there was a US needs more money to boost war. So Pentagon was saying this just now, October 2019. So the military is still very involved with this. These are two Dutch headlines. One says almost 1 in 5 factories in the Netherlands has problems with supply. So of course, a lot of this is COVID related, but just to indicate that this whole idea of like, oh, we need more metals and this demand is going up, but supply is not scaling up. This actually has a real effect already. It's not some hypothetical future problem that we are going to face maybe in the future. Just like right now, this year, there's a huge number of factories, at least in the Netherlands and also abroad, that have these problems. And then another one is, this is not metals related, so this is what happens if a country doesn't pay enough attention to, and this is really from security of supply perspective a lot, to like having your raw materials. So the Netherlands is very gas dependent, and we didn't really pay attention. And right now, all of our gas supplies are empty, our gas storage facilities. So now Vladimir Putin can decide, okay, we're going, this says, Putin gives these, says to fill up the gas supplies in Europe. So now we're in a situation in this winter where we just have to wait for Vladimir Putin to tell us whether our houses are warm or not. So this is a very unpleasant situation. I know we're in Armenia right now, so you guys are way more used to this style of like countries just telling other countries what to do. But for the Netherlands, this is like an unpleasant and very new situation to be in. And the reason why this is happening is because as a country, the Netherlands and also Europe in general is just so used to just the free market, and we just say, oh, we want more of this, we pay for it, and then we get it, right? But if you get real supply crunches where countries that supply this are not really interested in only making money, but also just in having geopolitical power, you get into these problems. Okay, so that's just to set the stage a bit. So what I'm going to show you, and if there are any questions, by the way, you can just interrupt me. What I did, I'll show you some numbers for some research that we just very recently published. And what we did was we looked at the Dutch scenarios. So these are actually, again, Dutch reports made by all the Dutch energy companies and the Dutch utility companies. And the Netherlands is I don't know, I guess, famous for being very planned. So there are a very large number of planning exercises. So what they did, they said, okay, we have these policy goals in the Netherlands that we need to reach. And these are basically European policy goals where they say, okay, you need to reduce the CO2 emissions by X% in 2030, 2040, 2050. We translate this to the Dutch context where we say, okay, we more electric cars, more electrification, more cables. And then they did some really detailed analysis of, okay, how many cables do we need? How many wind turbines? Where are we going to put them? What are different scenarios for the electric cars? So how much stuff do we really need to build? So these are capacity planning studies where they really say, okay, what are we really going to build? Not these vague general extrapolations. So let's say the World Bank, you also did a report, and these are based on, let's say, very general rough estimates for how much you need in the world. And these are nice because these are actual numbers based on the actual number of kilometers that you need and actual things that they're going to build. So that's
a material resource.
Yeah, so basically what they did is they just said we are going to build so many cables and so many stations.
So we need this much copper, we need this much.
Yeah, that's what we added to it because they don't care about the copper content. They just said we need to build, we just need to hire X number of people and buy Y number of cables. And then we did took their numbers and translated that into, okay, now you know how much money you need to spend and when, because it's like an investment agenda. But now we're going to tell you how much materials do you need, because they had no clue how much they need, right? So that's kind of the exercise we did here. Say, you know, you need X billion euros to do this. That's a lot of money, but now we're going to tell you you need Y million tons of copper.
And this is only for Netherlands?
Yeah, I'm going to show you the Dutch numbers, which is really good to keep in mind that these numbers are going to be quite high and only for the Netherlands. So this kind of give you a little bit of perspective. So the Netherlands, in terms of global GDP, we have 0.8% of global GDP, 0.5% of global energy, and 0.2% of global population. And if you then, because Netherlands is kind of representative EU, so in your mind you can upscale the numbers I'll show you by, let's say, about 20 times if you look at GDP or 40 to 50 times if you look at population. So this is also interesting from a, let's say, fairness perspective, right? You could say, okay, the Netherlands has 1% of global GDP, so maybe we have a right to 1% of the global metals production. If you purely, that's not how the world works, but maybe you could think like this, or you could say, well, we have 0.2% of the population, so maybe we have a right to using 0.2% of the global metals production in a fair world. And of course, it's not a fair world, so the Dutch use way more, and then there are other countries that use way less. But like, kind of, if you want to, and I didn't write this in the report because we did write this down once, and we got a lot of shit from people that were like, like, as soon as you start talking about fairness, it becomes complicated from a political point of view, and this was paid for by the government, so they were like, please don't make our life very difficult.
So, does Netherlands, you have nearly 10% of Europe's population? No, what is
No, this is
point
of the
two?
global population. So the Netherlands is 0.2% of the whole world,
Yeah.
and
but-
Europe is 10% of the whole world.
The Europe is
EU is
okay,
on
not the
the
whole.
EU.
thing. So,
So Dutch, Netherlands, and Europe. Yeah, I could imagine the table. But just to give you an idea of like, yeah. And then the idea is like, you know, if you think about 1% for the Dutch or like roughly 15% for Europe, like what would be okay?
Can I just have a question?
Yes.
How does it come that Netherlands have only like 2% of EU populations, but still uses
0.2% of global
yeah,
population.
but 2% of EU population,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it still has 5% of EU energy consumption?
Yes.
Is it really that Netherlands uses so much more power than other EU countries?
Yes. Well, so EU also includes like Eastern European countries that in general have like half the GDP. I don't know exactly, but let's say Bulgaria and Hungary, they have way lower both GDP and energy use. And you should also think about GDP, like energy use is not just, it's really strongly related to GDP because it's not just the personal, like me, personal life, and someone else, someone in Hungary using, like maybe I'll use a little bit more energy, but not 2 times as much. But because we have a much larger economy, we also use much more energy just because the factories are bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So the overall economy has a higher energy intensity just because it's like related to GDP, right? So it's not just I drive my car is 5 times as large as a Hungarian car, but also there's a factory somewhere which uses.
Industrial country.
Yeah. So
But shipping industry is in there, or that's separate?
I don't know. I don't.
They use a lot of energy.
This is yeah, okay, but let the exact statistics are not important. This is order of magnitude 1%, right? Okay, so what does this mean? It's gonna if you want to know all the details, you can always read the report. But if we just do our Dutch policy as the Dutch government stated that this is what we want to do, and keep in mind this is actually much less than what we should be doing. This is just what our government says, okay, this is what we can do, and then we end up like still like not achieving our climate targets. So, okay, the way you should read this graph is 20, let's say the next 10 years, 2020, 2030, 2030 to 2040, and then 2040 to 2050, as a percentage of global production in 2020. So 0% up to 25% of the global production. And these are 10 of the metals that we think are relevant. So you see that, for instance, for iridium, the Dutch are going to need, you need iridium for hydrogen. So the Dutch government said, we're going to use a lot of hydrogen. If you put that into numbers, we're going to use 25% of global production of iridium just for the Dutch production of hydrogen. That's a lot, right? And lithium up to 15%, neodymium 15% kind of goes down. But even then, for platinum and nickel, you're like in the like 5% range of global production. And this is, of course, production in 2020. So the production is going to increase between now and 2050. But this graph is, and the reason why we didn't use the future production numbers is because nobody knows what the future production numbers are, right? So it could grow by a few percent per year. That's kind of what's historically the average been doing. But if they have multiple uncertain numbers over each other, it becomes really hard to read the graphs. So when you look at this number, keep in mind, doesn't mean that we're going to use 25% of the total globe in 2050, but what you should be looking at is like, okay, is that at all achievable, right? Is it achievable that only the Netherlands, as a tiny little country, is going to end up using a really significant fraction of the world's production for a number of these critical materials only for energy transition, right? That doesn't take into account any military and economic and general other stuff. Our economy will also be growing. Everyone will be using this.
And
So
this is only for energy?
this is only the energy transition. So only the wind turbines, the cables, the
Okay.
electric cars, nothing else.
Hmm.
Because if you do everything, it becomes exponentially more difficult to model. You don't need to model any of this. It's just like these numbers show that it's a lot. It's kind of ridiculous, like the amount. So like order of magnitude, it's ridiculous. These numbers are not exactly accurate. It's just to show that if you just blindly follow the current trends and then kind of say, okay, we're just going to do what the government says we do, then you end up with these situations where you need a very large amount of metals. Just for the Netherlands. And then, you can take these numbers, multiply them by 20, and then you get European numbers. Wow, that's a lot. Then you multiply them again by, let's say, 10, then you get the global numbers. Like, okay, that makes no sense at all. Okay.
So there's budget. Yeah.
Okay, yes, you were saying.
Right, so completely distracted. That's
Yeah.
okay. I distracted myself. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So any questions until now? No?
Oh,
How are you?
Yeah, you go first.
I just wanted to ask if you have also done any analysis related how you're gonna get that amount of metals, from where do you have like resources, or if no, how you're gonna get them?
Well,
That's why she's here.
yeah. So actually, the next.
Now he will show us how much they plan to extract from Armenia. Like
Yeah, we're gonna
cover
gonna
the
buzz
trip.
out. We're gonna start negotiating.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, no, it's like one of the reasons to come to Armenia, because you guys actually produce some of these metals. So one of the things that I always tell when I give this presentation to Dutch policymakers, I always say, look, you can't just make these policies and then expect these things to come from out of thin air. Like what I said at the beginning, all these other countries are positioning themselves to own these supply chains. That's really bad. On the other hand, the Dutch are always super like holier than thou when it comes to environment, and this producing these metals is very like potentially, like currently, it's super damaging. You could do it in a nicer way, but that's not how it's being done now. So if the Dutch government says we want these policies, they should combine it with, and this is how we want to get the materials. And there's like zero thought about this. So quite often I'm trying to bring this message to the Dutch government. And it's interesting because there are like multiple ministries often listening to this, and it's a bit unclear whose responsibility this is, like economic affairs or internal affairs. And before, when I was giving this presentation, like these types of talks, they would always send representatives from all the ministries, and it'd be like, oh, very interesting. But now actually nobody comes anymore from the ministries, because now they realize this is a real problem, and the first person to show up is the person that's going to pay for the report. So I think it's actually a positive sign that none of the high-level people come to my talks anymore. They only send the low-level people. So I'm like, just kind of waiting, like, okay, let's see what happens. But that's like the internal Dutch way of doing it. Yeah. So this is not where are we going to get it from. This is where we're going to currently get it from. But before I go to that, is that a question about the peak square? Never mind. Okay. So what you see here, this is my Sankey diagram. So,
And we have a question from Zoom.
oh yes. Tell me.
Hello, should I ask my question?
Yes.
So Mr. Benjamin, so I have one question during those meetings. So one of the concerns is using, let's say, the batteries in electric buses, etc., and it's becoming very trendy. However, there's another side of the argument that says, why not, instead of using electric buses and using the resources in the batteries there, we change back to trolley buses, tramways, etc. Have there been these types of discussions taking place, according to your knowledge, in the municipality level or on ministry levels?
Can you repeat the last part of your question? I didn't.
Reverting, instead of using electric buses in the cities, it would be more ideal to use trolley buses or tramways like before.
Okay, yes, good question. Yeah, no, okay, hold that thought because I'm going to talk about that also after this slide, I think. Because yeah, the question what you're saying is basically, okay, is there not something else you can do instead of one-for-one replacement of a normal bus with electric bus? Just use a different technology that still transports people but uses less critical raw materials for the same functionality. We'll get to that, but yeah, in principle, this is possible, but are people talking about it? Not so much. So this graph, yeah, so the words are in Dutch because it was a Dutch report, but basically here you see where does it all come from, and then the different metals, so copper, silver, silicon, nickel, and then for which applications is it being used, where does it go to? And what we see is a lot comes from China, South Africa, Australia, DRC, Russia, and there's a whole bunch of little countries. What you don't see in these type of analysis is that China has a really large role in a lot of these supply chains. So let's say DRC, they produce a lot of cobalt, but actually the mines in DRC are largely owned by Chinese companies. And then a lot of this stuff is shipped off to China and processed in China into the right chemical form for use in batteries. So that's interesting. Russia is also a big player in this. Like I learned this visit that almost all of the mines in Armenia are Russian owned nowadays. So there's a number of countries that are really positioning themselves to own these supply chains. And the reason is because like the last decades were all oil based, and a lot of power comes from owning the oil supply chains. That was really like for a large part the Western world that controlled a lot of this, and OPEC. And now they're like, okay, so there's a reset of geopolitical power. So we can go to owning all the metal. You kind of own the supply chains in the same way that you used to have power when you had oil and gas.
The distribution networks, for instance. Supply chain is like distribution networks. If you own the distribution network, you have some control. Same thing if you have over the supply chain.
Yeah.
Russia is the 6th, right, in the list after Congo.
Yeah.
Rusland. Yeah.
And this is what we actually in the Netherlands, how we get our stuff currently. So this is your question was like, where are we going to get it in the future? I have no clue, but this is where we are getting it now.
And
so
the part of this also the question was, is there enough from the existing reserves?
So in principle, in terms of is there enough in the ground? Probably yes. Maybe not for all metals, but then there will be a small problem. You can quite easily switch, let's say, between palladium and platinum, and iridium. You can kind of go back and forth. So it's not really a problem of is there enough in the ground, because like there's a lot in, and especially if you go to like the sea or to very low concentrations. But really the problem is, can we get it out in time? And B, can we get it out without destroying the whole planet? Like, what's the point in getting all the electric cars if you then have to like poison all the jungles that you want to save with electric cars? Now, it's not that bad because even if you make the metals in a really nasty way like we make them now, still it is a lot better than using fossil fuels, because fossil fuel production is also extraction of raw materials, but it just keeps going, right? So for one electric car, you need a few hundred kilograms of metals and you're done. But if you have a diesel car, you need to tank every time you fill it up, you take stuff from the ground. So like sometimes people use this as an argument against electric cars. They say, oh, well, let's not do electric cars. But like fossil fuels are way worse. Like coal mines are way worse than metal mines. But that doesn't mean that we cannot use this as an opportunity to do metal mining better. That's, I think, a really important detail. So there's enough, but we need to be on time with the mines. So let's say if we want to have all the electric cars in 2030, we should be building the mines today. We're not building the mines today, so we're going to have a problem in 2030. Not because there isn't enough, just because the production rate is too low. So in terms of energy transition, which is like really one of the major policies of the European Union nowadays, really large risk of supply disruptions. They're already happening, and I think they're just like every year from now on, we're going to get really large supply disruptions. So in the past, they were like every couple of years something would happen. But I think the chance of these disruptions and the severity of these disruptions is going to go exponentially up in the coming decade, which is not only unpleasant in terms of it costs money and jobs, but also just like it delays these transitions, and delaying a transition means you overshoot your climate targets. That's really damaging for all of us. So you get these really big dependencies, you get production and concentrated in countries, so you get the shifts in geopolitical power, which may or may not be a problem. I mean, as a scientist, I'm very neutral on this, but as a European, I think it's an unpleasant idea. And then there's a serious lack of knowledge and prioritization to this topic, right? So of course people know about this, like many people have been writing reports for the last 20 years already. People are saying, oh, look at the metals, it's a problem. But like in terms of, okay, what do we actually do now? Like really, not just write a report, but like really on the ground, like physical changes, it's kind of difficult to figure this out. So these risk mitigation strategies, especially in the European context, because China has this figured out. They decided that they're going to mitigate the risks by buying all the mines. So now they own the mines. So now we have a bigger problem. And then let's say in Armenia also, like there are many mines. They're owned by Russians now. Okay, is that a problem? It's not a problem. You need to think about this. It's not necessarily it is a problem, but it's a risk at least. So the question from Zoom, we're going to go to solutions. And we link this to circular economy because that's the biggest hype nowadays. So in general, you can think about the classes of solutions in 4 terms. So from, let's say, big to small, rethink is the best one, where you say, okay, we've got to rethink the entire system to just use fundamentally less energy and less materials. So one really easy example is currently our system is designed around personal transport. So everyone has their own car. I have a car, you have a car, we all have our own car. The car stands around, does nothing for 95% of the time. This makes no sense. So instead of replacing all of our cars with Teslas, you can have shared mobility and people just use an app to rent a car the moment they need it. Then you can have the same access to mobility. I can still get a car whenever I want and drive anywhere I want. I just don't own the car. And then maybe the car usage goes up from 5% to 25%. That's like 5 times less material use for the same exact same functionality, right? So you can rethink these systems and use way less energy and materials. Material efficiency, substitution. So one of the examples would indeed be use trolleys instead of cars, buses with batteries. So you just have the same thing, but just substitute one technology for another. Or just become more efficient there. Like I talk to lots of factories and they say, yeah, materials are so cheap, we don't care. So we over-dimension everything. And we could easily use 20% less materials, but whatever, it costs nothing. So we'd rather be a little bit on the safe side and just use too much of it. So as soon as you make the materials more expensive, people just use 25% less material. That's super easy, like instantly. Repair. So obviously if your phone lasts 2 years, that's you need 1 phone per, let's say half a phone per year. If your phone lasts for 4 years, then you only need a quarter phone per year and you still have a phone. So this increasing lifespan of products makes a really large difference. And finally, recycling. Obviously, if you recycle more, then on the long run, you don't need so much more materials. Now, recycling is actually, it's interesting. This is where the majority of the European policy thinking and research money goes to, is to promote recycling. It's also one of the least effective things you can do in terms of circular economy, especially in energy transition, because what happens is these things like electric cars, especially cables and wind turbines, have a really long lifespan, right? They last for a minimum of 20 years. And we don't have any of them now. So next 10 years, you're going to build all these cables and wind turbines. They're going to stand around for 10, 20 years. That means that you don't start recycling anything until 2040, like another 20, 30 years. Maybe in 2050, you start getting all these materials back. So if you want to deal with the problem of materials today, recycling is fairly irrelevant, right? Because the system scales up and you can't really get to good recycling rates until you have a steady state system. So it's kind of weird that the European Union is really focusing all of its attention on recycling, but we also understand why, because recycling is super easy in social terms, right? You tell people, hey, you need to give up your car and you need to share your car with random other people, then you really directly impact people's lives. If you just say, throw your broken thing into 2 bins instead of 1 bin, that's like, you don't really force people to change their behavior. So it's politically much easier to achieve, but also kind of not so relevant. Also, the European Union is putting a lot of effort into domestic mining. So they really want to make more mines inside Europe. Yeah, I don't think that's really, for me, it feels like something that's really influenced by the mining lobby. Like sometimes I go to these meetings, they just have all these lobbyists from the mining companies and they're kind of pushing the EU in a certain direction. This is more my personal observation. I don't really.
But if there is a critical raw material bottleneck, I mean, one of the first things you look at is your internal resources.
Yes, there are very few, because Europe has been so densely populated for so long. Like most of the interesting critical raw materials are either gone. Like you could mine copper, 30% copper in the hills around Rome in the Roman times, right? And that's all gone now. So we basically extracted a lot of the resources in Europe on the one hand. On the other hand, it's just really expensive to do it in Europe. Like there are certain places where you could do it, but a lot of it, like in the Netherlands, there are places in the Netherlands where there's metals in the ground, but it's just so built up and the property is so expensive relatively to the price of the metals, it's really difficult to do. And then also just like not in my backyard, NIMBY problems, like, you know, you can fund mining feasibility studies all you want, but you're never going to actually manage to get them done because the civil society is really strong in Europe. I think it's, you know, this argument is a bit ridiculous, like, oh, we don't want to have it here, so then we go to Armenia and make a really dirty mine there, right? So that's like the kind of like iffy ethical part, but this is just the way it is.
No, but we might get to that point 2050 in any country this should happen. Otherwise, there is another topic that we need to go to mine under the ocean,
Yeah.
which is the
Even worse.
worst scenario.
Yeah.
So I think they first will think how they will use existing earth mines. Then
So I think there will be a bit of mining in Europe. It's kind of like the same with nuclear power plants. They spend a lot of time talking about it, but in the end, you can only build a couple of them. So the total contribution to the problem is actually very small. So same with mining. It's going to cause a huge amount of societal debate.
Discord debate, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Cause a lot of, and then, you know, you might make some mines. I think that's fine. It's totally okay to build some mines in Europe, but compared to the scale of the demand, it's not going to really make a dent.
There's a question in the chat.
Is there? No, okay. So then we actually did some modeling. So this was also, I think, the most maybe innovative part of this work in terms of scientific interestingness. We spent a fair amount of time talking to experts and to companies to kind of figure out, okay, what do you realistically expect according to these 4 strategies that we could do? How much does it help with reducing material demand? And you see here, this is kind of like a waterfall diagram. So for each of these different 4 strategies, well, this bar is the demand that we would have normally, and then this bar is what you would have left if you do all of these strategies. You kind of see the different contributions. And what you mostly see here is that there's not one silver bullet, or you need to take on all of these 4 strategies at the same time. And if you implement everything simultaneously, then for a lot of metals, you can get quite far.
What is the dark gray?
You can see in the graph, this is like what's left after you. So this is
The gap, what you would need to find?
Yeah, what you would still need to produce after you implement all of these strategies, what's left. Now, this is of course fairly uncertain, especially the rethink part. Like if you do really fundamental rethink, there would be way more. But this is kind of what people expect that realistically you could achieve if you go for maximum system change. So there's something weird about this graph. Does anyone see?
How come the platina has more after you do all this?
Very good. This is exactly the question. So why? What's going on here?
Is it because
Replace the end of production. Yeah,
Which one?
I don't know which one, but one of the other ones which is reducing. We
Yeah,
replace
yeah,
it.
Very good. Exactly. So this is what happens is iridium and platinum are both used for hydrogen, and they're both PGM, so they're substitutable. So you can substitute iridium for platinum. So the next question is, you found this, why is this one going down this much? This one only going up by that much? Like what's
It's
going
more
on?
efficient to use platinum probably. You need less amounts to produce the same.
No, you need the same amounts. So it's 1-for-1 substitution. But still the graph is smaller. What's going on here?
Does that have to do with the rethink part?
No.
But there should be then some other supply.
No.
source Or something, no?
No? You want me to give it away? Okay, so the answer is this is in
Oh,
terms
it's
of
the
global
percentage
production.
thing, yeah.
So the global production for iridium is much smaller than for platinum. So you can take down 30% of the global production here, and it only adds a few percent of platinum production. And so that's also like one of these things that makes this a bit, say, complicated. Like nickel, we need in absolute terms way more nickel than we need platinum or dysprosium or neodymium. But just the global market for nickel is huge, so it's not so. And that's the part where you think about criticality. So if you would make this graph for environmental impact, so how much damage do you cause to the environment, then actually nickel would be really high because we need a huge amount of nickel. Nickel is super damaging to produce. But this graph is not about environmental impact. This graph is about criticality and about supply in terms of global production, which is a totally different type of thinking. So you have different type of graph. Okay, so what do we actually do now? So this is, so what I show now is, this is kind of for the Netherlands because every country is unique. So there's also the problem with European policy versus national policy. The EU is by definition quite abstract and high level. So there's a huge amount of research at EU level being done. I do some European projects and they give us lots of money to think about what should the EU do. But the European Union is really big, right? So they come up with these really abstract things, but what should the Netherlands really do? That's a really different question. And same like, let's say, connected to Armenia, like a lot of this research is not relevant for Armenia because it's general stuff. And if you look at the EU, a lot of the European policy analysis kind of gives the answer, what should Germany and France do? Right? Because those are really big countries. Or what should Belgium do? Because they have a really large position in the supply chain of these metals. So if we, as the Netherlands, just take the European recommendations, that would be really dumb because we'd be implementing recommendations for Germany in the Netherlands. Makes no sense. And I don't know what this would mean in Armenian terms, but you can definitely not take this and translate it to Armenia because the Armenian context is totally different. So the step from abstract, oh, we need to rethink the system, down to what does the system actually look like in your country and what do you need to do with your system? That's like that translation layer is something that's not being done very well right now. And that's actually one of the things that we're doing with Alan and Irina here in Armenia. It's like thinking about, okay, let's look at the actual tailing sites in Armenia and really understand the Armenian context and try to come up with pilots for Armenia with the current actual things that happen. And that's really difficult if you, as a scientist, used to like getting this like kind of abstract, broad things. Anyway, that being said, for the Netherlands at least, and I think these are like generally things that are smart to do for everyone. So we don't have any production of things in the Netherlands, right? There are some, but generally we import everything from China and other countries. So we're not going to change the products. It's not like the Netherlands can say, oh, we need different types of laptops because we don't make the laptops. But there are some things that we do. So there's a lot of design work and assembly work happening in the Netherlands. So we could actually influence how these products are at the design stage. So that's like unique Dutch contribution. Like then we ship off the designs to the factories, they make it. But in the design phase, there are really a lot of things. I also work for the Faculty of Industrial Design. So this is very much, I would say this because that's my work, but okay. Lifespan increase, that's something that countries can do by themselves, right? You get products, you import them, but then how long do you deal with these products? That's really also up to how do people behave with the products. Do you have any facilities to repair products or not? Do you just throw them away? Do you force companies to give long-term guarantees? So let's say in Europe or in the Netherlands, every product you buy has a minimum 2-year guarantee. In America, every product has a minimum 1-year guarantee. And then you see actually that the same companies, they will either sell products in Europe that are a little bit better quality or last a little bit longer, or at least they will provide repair facilities. So the average lifetime of a laptop and a car, etc., in Europe is a little bit higher, I think, than in America, just by these types of regulations. And then recycling, I just mentioned that it's kind of useless on long term. However, on the short term, you still really need to do it. And building up a recycling infrastructure can take decades. So even if it doesn't make a difference today, you do need to start taking it very serious today. Otherwise, you have a really big problem in 10, 20 years. And even if you still like small scale recycling, in terms of percentages, is still quite a lot in terms of not having any landfills, not having trash on the street, stuff like that. So recycling is really important from perspective of your country. And then what do you need? Those are like the basics that you need to do. And again, this is really what we would need. So it would be interesting to hear from you guys. What do you think requirements would be for Armenia, for the Armenian context? So I think for European countries, we still need a lot of monitoring and development of knowledge. And by knowledge development, I mean like these steps from these broad, we need to rethink the system to, okay, what does it actually mean in the exact context that I'm looking at? Transparency of supply chains, quite like this graph that I showed you with these like nice, that looks really nice, but it's based on a lot of assumptions. Like we don't really know exactly what's going on. You have no clue what's in the laptop, where does it come from, which hands, does it come from Myanmar or from Vietnam, or nobody really knows what's going on. So you need some transparency in these supply chains in order to be able to make decisions. And you need
Sorry, what kind of decisions? Like whether they're conformed with environmental regulations, child labor issues. Is that the kind of transparency you're looking for? Or?
You need it basically for everything. But also, let's say you want to improve your recycling, you need to know what's in a product. So like low-level recycling, you can just throw a laptop in a shredder and then sort it out afterwards. But high-level recycling, you need to keep the materials separate in a more clean way. So you like disassemble and you take all the plastic shells and put them in a bin, and take all the metal bits, put them in a bin. But then you need to know which types of plastics are they. And actually people really often don't know. Like, okay, it's some kind of aluminium, but like which exact alloy is it, or what type of plastic is it? If you mix the wrong plastics, like if you have a really nice pure stream, plastic is perfectly recyclable. If you chuck in PVC, something that has chlorine in it, and you have PE, polyethylene, then it really ruins the quality of the end product. And for these, you just need to understand what's going on. That's one of the answers. But like, also in terms of product design, you want to redesign your product, you need to know what the problems are. Long-term policies. So I mentioned all these things I mentioned are long-term problems. Like, the World Bank project that I'm here for now, just getting the first report out the door took us a couple. So before they make their full term, so let's say every 3 years, that means that policy is formed in the first 100 days of the new government, then they do it for like a year or two, then the government falls again. They want to have something to show for it, so policy because they have much longer term political horizon than a country like the Netherlands. I tell the politicians, like, yeah, this is going to be a huge problem in 5 to 10 years. They say, okay, come back to us in 5 to 10 years. So, yeah.
If I'm around, I'll do something.
Yeah. Yes.
Nurses, also good quality assurance. Right. Good quality assurance.
Quality assurance. That's important. Yes. Yes. Also,
says
that.
Right.
Yeah, I think that goes into
monitoring.
yeah, well, it goes into everything, but also like the repair, like the longer lifespan for your products, like product.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this is something people like to talk about. Often it's just shitty quality. Yeah.
In terms of substitution of raw materials, what about the so-called composite metals, composite materials?
Yeah, that's terrible. Those are way worse. like composite materials are really difficult to recycle, right? So this is actually one of the tensions where if you redesign your product to dematerialize, so let's say I make a car which uses composites and then it's way lighter, so it weighs like 20% less. That's really nice because it not only do you need 20% less materials, but also the energy used during the use phase is much lower, etc. So then your life cycle assessment scores become much better. But at the end of the road, composites are really hard to recycle.
So only in terms of recycling is problematic, right? Not in terms of substitution.
Extraction goes out. And what are the materials that we're talking about? Is it
Well,
oil-based or what? Or are they?
Well, composite materials are recycled materials, right?
No, composite materials are just like two different materials stuck together. Yeah, it is like composite is super broad. Like you have anything that has, let's say, two types of plastics in one blend. Like you blend metals. Like alloys are composite. Usually you use it for, say, carbon fibers. We say you have epoxy and carbon.
Yeah, okay. Different understanding about
Yeah. So what do you mean? You mean recycled materials?
well, recycled materials and not, at least not, well, okay, it can be raw materials or some optimal raw materials, which is which doesn't demand the extracting all the way.
Yeah.
So
that would be better, of course.
but are there technologies to use this kind of materials versus materials from the tailing dams? Not
Well,
yet.
materials from tailing dams are minerals. So then actually in the Netherlands, we use those. So there are some mines in the Netherlands, and then we use all of that material, we recycle it, and we use it for, let's say, road construction. So you can take materials and you can use, like if you make a highway, you can use it as aggregates in a highway. So that's like the way in Europe that we deal with a lot of mining waste. But then you need to have the mining waste stabilized. So actually one of the things that we're looking at is to leach, like this, the mining waste currently is kind of poisonous and then you can't use it. So if you leach it out and make sure that it's inert material that doesn't leach any poisons anymore, like toxic materials, then you can use it for building houses and stuff like that. So yeah, that's really possible to do it like that. There's not circular, it's more like cascading, where you say, okay, we have some low level out like materials that we can use. Yeah.
And then there's material substitution potentials, but maybe not at the short horizon. We're talking about carbon-based, electric conductivity, where it replaces wires, metal wires.
So actually, like in the short run, substitution is really nice. So I think substitution here is part of the reduce. So this second bar. So this is substitution. Now we go from platinum to iridium. And it's actually the main response. So whenever there's a supply disruption and the price goes up, then companies, the first thing they do is they substitute. They say, okay, we don't use chromium in our steel, but we use vanadium or something, vanadium, right? So you can, within metals, you can substitute quite easily. The problem becomes when everything is scarce at the same time, then it becomes really hard to substitute. And then you need to go to these really fundamental substitutions where you say we use carbon instead of metals. Yeah, but those are like long-term, like that takes like 10, 20 years to do that. So like there's different levels of substitution always. I think like there's a nice anecdote from, again, my Shell professor said, yeah, so they needed to replace all the natural gas lines in America. Like, I don't remember when, like long time ago. And they needed to replace it with stainless steel. And so they started off with chromium-based stainless steel, and then they ran out of chromium, so they switched to vanadium stainless steel. Yeah, no problem. They ran out of vanadium, then they went to the next one. They ran out of that, and suddenly they ran out of the last substitution, and then all the prices of the metals shot up at the same time. So what happens in the perfect market? So this is not a perfect market, right? Because there's China and Russia, and they don't behave like perfect markets. But in theory, if you have a perfect market, it means that all the materials stay really cheap until suddenly you run out of the last substitution options, and then all the prices shoot up at the same time because the elasticity is gone. And then you have an even bigger problem because everything is scarce at the same time. And that's what's going to happen here in the future, because like we need so much of the stuff for everything that you're going to run out of substitution options, because one technology goes from this option to that one, but maybe this sector goes from this one to that one, and you're substituting, cross-substituting kind of, right? And then this becomes really complex because nobody understands everything. I understand the substitutes for hydrogen, but maybe you also need it for food production. And maybe in the food production sector, they substitute the other direction, but I don't know anything about food production, right? So, but they're connected via these material streams. And this is impossible to notice. We call it a complex adaptive system. Like these systems are too complex for people to really understand. So just like random shit happens and you just kind of like, okay, fine. And that's why you talk about resilience. Like the very first slide, you remember there was the national emergency and it used the word resilience. So resilience is what you do when you cannot prevent problems from happening because the world is too complex. So you build resilience. So if a problem happens, you don't, it doesn't kill you. Like kind of like with earthquakes. You cannot prevent an earthquake, but you can prevent the damage coming from the earthquake.
So what do you?
I'm sorry. From them.
Yes.
No, right?
Sorry, I have one question based on what you were discussing right now relating to the prices. So from the charts, I could see that a lot of these materials, they're the critical materials that you mentioned, they're also what we call the rare materials, the rare earth materials. So I'm guessing they're not available in many places. Have there been discussions on what could happen if for some reasons, as you mentioned, all the prices shoot up? As I can give you one example of what we see these days, silicon, for example, these days, there's a problem in the supply chain worldwide and silicon is pretty abundant, but these materials, they're not as abundant. Is this a critical issue that has been discussed on what could happen if the supply chains for these rare earth materials are disrupted in terms of either the pricing or even the quantities aren't available anymore?
Yes. So first of all, they're called rare earth elements, but they're not so rare. And the reason why they're called rare earth elements is because they're chemically really difficult to separate. And then when they were discovered in the late 1800s, they thought they were really rare because it was so difficult to produce them. Like, oh my God, I have one tiny little bit of neodymium. This is amazing. This is super rare, but actually it's not so rare. It's just like, you need really strong acids to separate them. And then in the 1950s, they found it everywhere. So like the problem with these rare earth elements is because they're so chemically hard to separate, also the environmental damage you cause by producing them, if you don't do it really nicely, is really large. So actually America was the biggest producer of these things in the 1950s, 60s, and it caused so much damage to the environment that the environmentalists, so this is kind of like ironic, they actually promoted exporting this production of these rare earth elements to China, I think in the 80s, because they wanted, it was in California. So the Californians said, no, California is too precious and we don't want to destroy California, so let the Chinese destroy their own country. So now the Americans don't have rare earth element production anymore. The Chinese have all of it, and this was done actively promoted by the environmental movement in America because they didn't like the environmental damage. It's like some little history. But then the second part, what happens if you run out? This happened in 2010, 2011. The price went up a lot, like 1,000%. And actually currently, like now, like a few days ago, the price went up again really high to the same level that it was in 2010. And then what happens is people just pay way more money. So some things don't get produced because they're too expensive, or they get produced to a much lower quality. So there's like 1 year, 2011, 2012, if you buy a washing machine from that year, the chances are pretty high that the quality of your electric motors is really low, just because the producers decided to say, okay, we're going to stop our factories. Nah, let's just put really shitty magnets in the washing machines and we'll deal with it later. So then all the washing machines started breaking after a few years instead of after 10 years. So that's one effect. The other effect is actually that because things become rare, suddenly certain countries that produce this have more power. So actually the Chinese forced a lot of factories to move to China in the period after this price peak. They said, hey, price went up a lot. That was really nasty. You didn't like that. Do you want to prevent these price peaks from happening? Then maybe move your factory to China. And a lot of these companies are multinationals, right? So they don't care whether the factory is in the Netherlands or in Germany or in China. It's like, it's irrelevant to them. So they moved a lot of production capacity to China because of these scarcity issues. And it's interesting, I don't have it here, but in other presentations, I have like price graphs. And you can see that the price inside China is a lot lower than the price outside of China, because they use it as an economic tool. So those are kind of the things that happen. And then when you get serious disruptions, then you get what happens, what I showed in the second slide, just like some factories that just stop working. So now in the Netherlands, 20% of the factories have to close every now and then, just because they don't have the materials they need, and that's what happens.
So hypothetically speaking, if Armenia owned its mines, it would be better just to sit on them and not export anything for another 30 years until there's a crisis.
Maybe, yes. I mean, but the problem with that is, so then you're basically speculating on prices of metals, and so yeah, so like OPEC does this, right? They just control the production and they try to keep the prices up. Like there are Chinese and Russian companies that do this. They buy 20 to 30% of the total global production of a certain metal because they speculate that the price is going to go up. So like the Fanya Metal Exchange, but they at a certain point they own like 1 year of the entire global production of indium, I think it was. It was like insane just having it in their stockpiles lying around. So now this is, in the end, it's a really bad idea because there are huge opportunity costs. Like you pay a lot to get the metal, and then that's basically money you invested in it, and then you just have to hope the price goes up. And if you're like Armenia, then you don't have the power to set the prices. If you're Saudi Arabia, you can play these games because you also can set the prices. And with your like the opportunity cost, if you don't export the metals, you don't make the money. It also means you can't use it to develop your country. So good idea, but in practice, it never really works out that way. On the other hand, like just maximally just producing as many metals as possible, and then that's also a really bad idea. Like, like if all these Russian companies produce all these metals in Armenia, who gets the benefits? It's not Armenia. All the money goes to Russia, and they don't really,
So one of the basic conclusions I'm hearing from you is that it is highly unlikely we'll get rid of hydrocarbons anytime soon. This energy transition is not going to be the nirvana of no fossil fuel. It is going to be a mix of fossil fuel going forward. Because this material scarcity issue is a global challenge, and I don't know if the mining sector is stepping up sufficiently to meet the material.
Well, it's a little bit of so the way I present it here is very dramatic, but of course there is some feedback loops. So if the price goes up, then people are really quite fast in reducing demand. So it's just basically I have no idea. Like it's a bit too difficult to tell what is going to happen.
A lot of projections are that you're going to continue. Fossil fuels are going to continue to have an important role at least through 2050.
Yeah,
after that.
I think this is probably realistic. Yeah.
What was the focus of this presentation is mostly on the scarcity and the criticality, right? The question of the price of all this technology. There's a very
but then also like this is only if you assume that nobody does anything. But like the whole point of these presentations, maybe not here, but definitely in Netherlands to policymakers, that they should actually do this. But this is in 2050, 2050, so there's plenty of time to actually implement these policies. So if these policies are implemented, then it's like the Y2K problem. Like there's a problem, but then in the end, the problem didn't manifest itself because people fixed the problem before it happened. And here, this is not going to be fixed completely before it happens, but still, I think like this is with if you just go straight ahead and don't think about it. But I think in the end, the world will, not do 100% of what we need to do, but at least do enough that it's not going to get that bad as it could be if we really don't. I hope, fingers crossed, that we'll implement enough of these policies. And, like institutions like the World Bank, they play a huge role in making that this. That people know about this, and then people actually do something about it. So feedback loop. So the last 10 seconds, I should just like I put the slide way at the end because I don't think anyone really cares in the current situation. But of course, this work was done with a very large team of people from different consultancy, different universities, paid for by a large number of provinces and utility companies that none of you know, but it's always good to say this is not work. I participated in the work and now I'm presenting it, but 90% of the work was done by a large team of people. And then we're already talking about questions, but I guess this is the end of the presentation. So any last burning, we're already 10 minutes over time, but any last burning questions, I can certainly address them. No? That's it.
Questions?
Just you use the term climate smart mining. I would like to understand what does it mean. Maybe it's not directly connected with the presentation. What it means.
Can I pass the question to Marina? Are you leaving? This is your question. What is climate smart mining?
Yeah, I have another meeting.
Okay. Climate smart mining is the worldwide project to improve the quality of mining, so it's not so
So environmental friendly mining, right?
It's energy transition and mining. If you Google climate
Okay.
smart mining, you will see
Yeah.
the details in the world.
Energy transition.
Yeah, this.
How to go
minerals
to
that
renewable,
need it.
if we're gonna reduce carbon emissions, you have to transition your energy production system. And
all these
and so
materials will
that
need-
has,
demand will go up. How you are going to do that? With smart mining, like using renewable energy in mining to make materials that need to be using renewable energy.
but also the materials needed to produce this renewable infrastructure.
And recycling, there are 12 strategies
Principles.
there in the end.
So it has nothing with the reduction of pollution and so on. It's just different with consumption.
Yeah,
It's it's a reduction of carbon emissions. But the whole, from the carbon
From that
dioxide
part of it.
perspective.
sorry,
So
I'm leaving, but I will try to come here early morning Wednesday
Okay.
to bring like this.
Oh, yes.
But you will be missing Levin's talk tomorrow, which will be
It's
very
fine.
exciting. Same
It-
time.
It will be fine.
Same
Again,
time,
I
5
will
to 6.
try my best, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
But if, even if you can't
Thanks.
personally come, you can connect via.
Yeah, if
Zoom.
it's online, I will do that. Definitely, thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks everyone online for joining, which is now only 2 people left, Nora and Sandy.
And we have 16 joined.
Mhm.